Oh hey, welcome back to my latest video of nonsense. Summer may be well on its way in certain places, but not so much here in sunny Wales, and my motivation to ride outside has been somewhat lacking. So, in an attempt to come up with a fun adventure kind of challenge, I thought, why not try to recreate the hardest stage of the 2024 Tour de France here in Wales? How very original. So first of all, I had to choose the stage to model my ride upon. While it's not close to the longest, nor even the hilliest, stage 19 is a bit of a monster, and has the potential to be pretty decisive as it falls on the third to last day of the tour. At about 145 kilometers with 4,400 meters of climbing, there's scarcely a flat section in sight. There's three main climbs being tackled: Col de Vars, Cim de la Bonnette, and Isla 2000, and I used the elevation gain of each of these climbs to segment my own route, with the general idea being that I'll complete hill repeats on a singular hill until accumulating the elevation gain of Col de Vars, then ride to another hill and rep it out to mirror Bonnette, and finally the same for Isla. Obviously there's a bit of climbing amassed in the miles between the hills, but the route I planned actually worked out to line up fairly spot on. The hills I've chosen are somewhat in the middle of nowhere up in the Brecon Beacons: Devil's Elbow, Bulk Cerrig Duon, and Llywel Hill. This is the route I brewed up. It starts with a rolling 15 kilometers, and then I'll do 6 repeats of Devil's Elbow, then ride about 15k to Bulk Cerrig Duon and do 5 reps of that. And then finally, it's a 10-kilometer ride to Llywel Hill, which I'll do 8 times until I accumulate the 1,065 meters of Isla 2000. So that's the hard part done. Now I just have to ride it. Introducing Superpool. We used to embark on challenges well out of our depth back when I first started cycling, and although we can't ride together anymore, he continues to support me. It's really massively appreciated, and without his help, this ride of horrors wouldn't have occurred. So here we are setting off from Pont Nedd Becan. This sits just along the southern border of the Brecon Beacons and is well known for its waterfalls, and basically from here I was heading directly into the lands of no surface. This first 15 kilometers was just to get to the first block of hills, but it still involved nearly 500 meters of ascent as I had to climb up the backside of Devil's Elbow. There are very few roads in this region of Wales. Basically you either have to ride on main route A roads or very narrow little lanes, and I was of course sticking to the latter. This winter has been the 8th wettest in history, with March experiencing more than 1.5 times the average rainfall, and as a result the state of the roads has been pretty dire, so I have to say that these lanes were actually in much better nick than expected. Anyway, it might not be the Alps, but this is quite a nice road to ride along. It has these constant really sharp pitches and soon climbs up into quite an exposed environment, which is very classic terrain of the area. Of course that means that you're at the mercy of the wind, which boy oh boy will come into play later. You might be wondering, why didn't you at least wait for a slightly nicer day? Well, this is an accurate depiction of typical conditions of the last few months, and sometimes you just have to get on with things. My legs were feeling pretty bad from the start, but that's fairly standard. I didn't really rest for this in any way. I didn't actually know I was doing it until the day before, but I wasn't going to break any records, so whatever. And this whole first section was sort of a cross tailwind, and after a fairly uneventful 40 minutes I made it to the top of Devil's Elbow and rounded the corner to... It's a bad start. Now I am terrified of cows, and I'm still undecided as to whether it's a rational fear or extremely over the top, but those things have ruined many of my rides because I've refused to cycle through a herd of them. I guess it depends on their mood and whether they have calves around, and I'm sure most of the time they're completely unbothered by a passing human, but you just don't know. Eventually they sort of drifted out the way, although it did take a little while, and finally I was able to descend and embark on my first mountain climb of Col de Vars, aka 6 repeats of Devil's Elbow. And this is my turnaround at the bottom, graceful as ever. Alright, so Devil's Elbow is one of the more notable climbs of mid-South Wales. It's a touch under 2 kilometers at 10% and features 2 whole bends, which is pretty staggering for the UK. I both love and hate this hill. The gradients are nice, the views are fantastic, and you're unlikely to encounter many vehicles, but it's strangely difficult to get into a rhythm. I think it's because this first section is so straight and it doesn't look as steep as it actually is. It's also really quite bumpy, so you're sort of fighting the tarmac the whole way up. This was one of the first Welsh climbs I ever did, and I remember thinking it was unbelievably steep. It's really not that bad. That annoying knocking sound you'll frequently hear is actually the inside of my shoe hitting my crank. Sorry, quite annoying. I had a headwind up this long stretch. I was moving really slowly on those gradients, so it didn't make much of a difference, but it was nice to swing around this bend and get a little boost. I was being careful with the battery, so I only turned my front camera on for this first descent, but it was pretty smooth sailing for all 6 repeats. I wasn't really pacing it in any particular way, just kind of riding. It's not an easy hill, so you have to put in a bit of a dig just to get up. But the legs felt fine throughout, and fueling wise I was having a bit of flapjack cereal bar and Lucozade just about every repeat, sticking with the little and often plan. If we look at the Col de Vars equivalent, it's just under 19 kilometers at 5.4% for an elevation gain of about 1,040 meters, and 6 repeats of Devil's Elbow worked out to be about 1,100. I hope to ride the actual Col de Vars at some point. I'm sure it's a fitting image of this hill. It's not the most enjoyable descent in the world, as you have to grip on pretty tight with all the bumps, and on the lower section there was a lot of mud, and, well, it wasn't just mud, but you can see things coming from afar, so you can pick up a good amount of speed. These repeats took about an hour and 20, and then I set off to the next hill in good spirits. Col de Vars complete. This next section of my ride was to get to the base of the second block of climbing, but it included a few tough bergs along the way. After some classic narrow lane manoeuvring, I took the sharp left towards the Hale Senni climb, which was a lot tougher than I remembered at about 10% for a mile. Not ideal having to grind to a halt right at the bottom of it either. As I neared the summit, I began to get a little worried as I started to see this thick fog rolling in. Obviously there had been a bit of moisture knocking about on Devil's Elbow, but it actually looked brighter in this direction, so I was hoping I'd pop out the other side into some nice sunny weather, but just the opposite happened. I had to go on an A-road for a few miles, and things suddenly went from alright to absolutely miserable. It was a raging headwind, and the fog was turning into something more closely resembling actual rain, although that might just have been the wind driving it into me. Not a good sign when your thick thermal jacket gets penetrated by water. I should really have tried to stay more positive, but I knew that the next hill was super exposed and very affected by the wind, so safe to say my motivation took an almighty plummet. Kind of disappointed myself for getting into a negative mindset so quickly. I think it was just because I had some misplaced hope that things would brighten up. It was also supposed to be a nice low wind day, but I should really know by now not to trust the Met Office. At around 40 minutes after departing from Devil's Elbow, I arrived at the base of climb number 2, Fort Cerrig-Buan. The good news is that I was turning back on myself and would have a tailwind up the climb. The bad news is that the climb actually includes a bit of descending, which means it was going to be a little more complicated than the straightforward matter of flying up the climb and trying to get low against the wind on the descent. I had 5 repeats in store, and this was always the section of the route that I was looking forward to the least, simply because it's such a drawn-out climb, even though this challenge wasn't just about cramming the elevation gain, and I did have to acquire the distance somewhere. So it's 5.7 kilometers at 4.6%, and it basically just pitches up and down all the way. It starts relatively sheltered down here at the bottom, then climbs up to a really desolate environment. It's the sort of road that is probably stunning on a warm, sunny day, but it's always been pretty cold and windy when I've been up here. And even when it's not windy down below, it's always somehow blowing a gale at the top of this hill. So I was very apprehensive about what lay ahead as I started my first descent. And rightfully so, because it was absolutely horrible. Had I just been climbing this side and continuing over the top, it would have been quite alright. The main issue was just on the descents. It was so windy that I was having to pedal almost the entire way down, and these short little kicks took ages to get over. I was literally averaging less than 20 miles an hour, along with getting absolutely soaked to the bone in this grim drizzle fog. I met my dad at the top, who provided some words of optimism and piled on some more waterproofs.
I mean, it is kind of bright, you know, it's not pissing down.
Sorry, what was that?
It's not pissing down.
Right. If you know me, you'll know how much I absolutely hate riding with my legs covered, but I just feel like I can't pedal properly, so I usually opt for layering up my torso and just wearing shorts. But I did have to put on leg warmers which got so soaked that they started oozing soap. It was certainly hard to move properly in so many layers, so everything felt vaguely terrible, but I managed to avoid getting too cold and kept on top of fueling pretty well. I would really have liked to have stayed on the gas a bit more, as my mindset kind of shifted into let's just get through this mode. But my motivation never dipped too drastically, and I couldn't hang around feeling sorry for myself since I was literally choosing to do this for some fun. I tried to take a few videos, but, well... This is number 4. Oh, I can't be bothered. I think these few clips sum up my mood pretty well. Miserable. My footage from here is a bit lacking. The battery in my front camera was on its last legs and the whole thing started leaking water. It's quite a miracle it even survived. But I do have some footage from the real Soundholder, which is the mountain that I was trying to replicate. I rode this in real life in 2022 and had the footage saved. I was actually going to delete it recently because it's just been sitting there, but here we go. It finally has a use. Bonnet is about 23 kilometers at 6.8% for 1,550 meters of ascent. My bulk carried doing reps totaled about 1,360, so a little less there. Soundholder Bonnet sits at around 2,800 meters, so you definitely start to feel the effects of altitude, which I didn't go to the pains of replicating on this ride. But in all other aspects, it was spot on. Alright, so I have to admit that I made a slight amendment to my original route plan. I was meant to do 5 repeats of the southern side, but for my 5th repeat I actually did the northern ascent because the descent was just so incredibly slow and horrible. The northern side is a bit more sheltered, and it's almost identical to the main side that I had been doing. A bit over 5 kilometers at 4.4%. It was a much more pleasant descent, which also fired me up with some motivation, as I was going to be heading in that direction after finishing this set of repeats. Although the top section was still really exposed and I was climbing the drops at 2 miles an hour. In some ways this was maybe cheating, but to be honest I have no regrets. I still got the climbing done whilst managing to retain some sort of enjoyment factor. So it certainly took longer than I expected, but this bulk carried doing portion took around 2.5 hours, bringing us up to a total elapsed time of 5.5. After the glorious ascent of Fake Bonnet, which I was very happy to leave behind, I headed over towards the Well Hill. This was just a short 9 kilometers along rolling terrain, but still a few stingers in there. I was able to pop my Fly 6 back on after the first climb, and it survived nearly until the end. The weather was significantly better down here, still quite windy with some mist being blown about, but compared to the previous Hill of Hell, it was rather pleasant. So Thirlwell Hill is an interesting one. It was built by the Ministry of Defence and leads to military training grounds, so you definitely don't want to stray from the main road if you continue over the top. But this first section, which composes the entirety of the climb, is actually a single-lane dual carriageway. Slightly surreal to ride up, but it's nice not having to worry about cars coming down towards you, although there's actually a surprising amount of traffic. I was actually in a pretty good mood as I approached the first climb. I was able to take off a few layers and felt decent, but then I hit the first ramp and suddenly felt myself slowing down to an absolute crawl. I had ridden this climb once or twice before, but not for a few years, and in my memory it was much more evenly graded. Whereas although the average is only 8%, the second half is much gentler than the first, and it's quite a tough 15% right out the gate. For some reason, the official Strava segment ends on the other side of the castle grid after the climb's finished, but this is the one I was doing. So yeah, I had a slight mental wobble after the first climb when I realised I still had 7 reps to go, but I pulled myself together, and once I got through 3 or 4 repeats, the end was in sight. 1 to go! This final block of climbing was meant to replicate Isla 2000, which is serving as the summit finish to stage 19. Isla 2000 is roughly 16 kilometers at 7% for an elevation gain of 1,065 meters, while 8 repeats of Thirlwell worked out to be around 1,150. I rode Isla 2000 in real life last summer, which I loved, and it was pretty much the antithesis of all the roads I did on this ride. It's the main route to the ski resort, so it's super wide and smooth. This portion took about an hour and a half, and that brings us to the end of the ride. Time to take a deep dive into the stats. 143 kilometers, 4,356 meters. Power, whatever. Heart rate, irrelevant. TSS, just kidding. Who even knows what that is? That was fun. But in all seriousness, can't do that. In all seriousness, I really enjoyed this challenge. As you can imagine, my average speed was really quite slow, and despite not taking any proper breaks, I managed to rack up nearly an entire hour of stoppage time. All the faffing with clothes, cameras, and the initial cow complications added up pretty quickly. I'm also under no illusion that I would have completed this ride had it not been for the support I had, so I'm very grateful for that. It was really good to get this ride out of my system, and although I constantly insult Welsh roads, there is something special and beautiful about these kind of climbs out in the middle of nowhere. I do hope the real tour stage doesn't take quite this long to get through. But there we are. Thanks for coming along on this journey of pointlessness brought to you by the least charismatic person out there. It's been a challenge for us all.